Welcome everybody, Michael Hart here. Thanks for joining me. Tonight we're going to talk about, we're going to break down the WISC IV, and we'll do a deep dive, something like that, with the WISC IV, and we're going to kind of use that as a starting point to talk about the role of the WISC IV in diagnosing dyslexia. And we're going to take the map a little bit further. We're going to talk specifically about the most recent model, I think, that's being accepted in neuroscience with regard to working memory. And we'll talk about processing speed as well, both in terms of the relationship with the WISC IV and what that particularly measures, but also some more general things as well, and see how those two pieces of working memory and processing speed kind of fit together. So, some of you are somewhat familiar with the WISC to a certain degree. I know there's a lot of heterogeneity in the crowd, so I'm going to go ahead and I'll start with an overview. If I'm going too slow, let me know. If I'm going too fast, let me know. But I want to make sure that by the end of this tonight, you're never going to look at the WISC again and be uncomfortable with it, or you're never going to feel like you don't really understand what it's all about. And I've kind of repeated information to you a couple of times because I think it's important for you to really embed this in your long-term memory. Once you have it, you won't forget it. It will probably inform you in terms of going back to look at the latest eval for your child. And it probably will also inform you moving forward when or if your child needs to be assessed again, and they need to include the WISC or the WAIS in that. So this is how the WISC is structured. We most recently, in the 4th edition, we have broken out the WISC into 4 different indices. Okay, and that's what you're seeing on this page. So in the upper left, you've got verbal comprehension index. On the upper right, you've got perceptual reasoning index, and then in the lower quarters to the left, you've got working memory, and to the right, processing speed. Now, within those circles, the 3 subtests that you see in the upper left, similarities, vocabulary, and comprehension, those are the 3 subtests that we've talked about before, the standard scores of which get combined to provide you with what they call a verbal comprehension index score. Now, the subtests that you see in the blue are supplementary subtests. They can be used, they're usually given for one of 2 reasons. One, sometimes you want to tease out the information a little bit more with the person that you're actually testing, or 2, sometimes one of the normal subtests has been spoiled. In other words, the child's seen something they shouldn't see, and therefore they might be able to answer some questions that they normally wouldn't have had to. So you can see verbal comprehension is comprised of 3 subtests. Perceptual reasoning is also comprised of 3 subtests. I'm going to go through those subtests with you. And then working memory has 3, processing speed has 2. Now, historically, when they first built this test several decades ago, there were basically 2 indices. There was verbal reasoning and what they called nonverbal reasoning, which is now perceptual reasoning index. And what they found was that it made more sense conceptually and pragmatically to break out the tests that were measuring working memory and the tests that were measuring processing speed, because quite frankly, for kids in our population, kids who represent, kids who have dyslexia or other learning differences, their scores were so variable, particularly in the working memory area and the processing speed area, that it made more sense to pull them out because that was easier for us to drill down. Now, the most important reason, frankly, was that when you have that much variability within the subtest scores that are going to be wrapped up together to build that index score, then you basically render that index score meaningless because there's too much variability in the tests that went into that overall score. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But as you see here, the ostensible idea is that all of these 4 indices come together, and in the center of the page there's the full score, a full scale index IQ, full scale IQ. Now with our population, there's many times that we won't be using the full scale IQ because it's been rendered meaningless by virtue of all the variability on the 4 indices. So you'll see what I understand by that, what I mean by that in a little while. So 3 subtests for verbal comprehension, 3 very different things, measuring 3 different things. So the rubric or the general category is verbal comprehension, but really we're talking about, say for instance, similarities. Similarities really drills down into your reasoning abilities, but also concept formation. So the tester will ask the child to identify the similarity between 2 ostensibly dissimilar items, okay? And these are presented orally to the child. So it could be, I don't remember what, but it was something like, how are a bicycle and a train the same? Okay, so they have to somehow have been able to develop a concept that says, well, they're both forms of transportation. So that, and remember this is a test that's given from 6 years 0 months to 6 years 11 months. And so increasing complexity, and the child continues to answer the questions until they miss X number, then they go on to the next subtest. So you have concept formation, and then you have vocabulary, which is essentially word knowledge. We've talked a lot about vocabulary in the past. Now for the earlier kids, for the younger kids, they're asked to name the item in a picture, and for the older kids, they need to use their expressive language more fully and more completely and provide oral definitions for the words that we ask them to define. So that's the second one. And then the third one, comprehension, really is kind of gets into your kind of social sense, your common sense. So it's information about general principles, it's information about social situations, it's, you know, this is not an actual question, but it goes along the line of, you know, why don't people drink and drive? Something to that effect, okay? So it's just this whole kind of set of general principles that we expect a child of a certain age to be, to comprehend and understand and have part of their intellectual capabilities. Now, verbal comprehension index, very strong in terms of what we call the G factor, which is general intelligence or general ability. So it's a key component that we'll talk about when we talk about the diagnosis of dyslexia. Now, perceptual reasoning index, these are 3 very different things. First of all, block design is timed, so you really have to be careful with this one to make sure that the child's fine motor skills don't impact their ability to perform, because this is really about analyzing and understanding abstract visual stimuli, and the way you show that is by manipulating these red and white blocks, and you have to recreate designs that are showed to you from a folder. So it's, you know, it behooves you to be very quick with regard to how those stimuli kind of fit together. They're abstract, so instead of a puzzle, it's actually just these designs, and it's a very strong indicator of your overall perceptual reasoning. Now, picture concepts gets into categorizing visual information. By that I mean, you know, the tester presents the child with rows of pictures, and they have to choose one picture from each row to form some kind of a group with a common theme. So it may be a row of all kinds of different things, and they pick out an animal in every row, or they pick out you know, some kind of a vehicle in every row, something like that. And so they're, again, you know, they're using their visual reasoning to categorize and combine things in groups. Matrix reasoning is another good measure of general nonverbal intelligence. They're presented with a matrix that's incomplete, and they have 5 different options to choose from to complete that matrix. So again, it's kind of like this holistic way of being able to look at images, visual stimuli. Okay, so those are the big 2, and now we're going to talk a little bit about working memory. And when we finish this a little bit further down the road, we're going to talk about that model that is pretty well accepted within the academic and neuroscience community. Now, working memory is a very complicated concept, and you'll see that a little bit later. But basically, you know, there's 2 different subtests on the WISC that measure working memory, and they're both, you know, in fact, you see my first bullet here for digit span. It says auditory short-term memory. You know, that came right out of the catalog for this particular test. But, you know, as I sit here looking at it, I think, you know what, I really would change that to auditory working memory, because as you'll see, the definition of working memory is that you hold this bits of data in your brain for just a brief while, and if you don't continue to work on that, then it fades and it's gone. So we're talking about working memory, sequencing skills. You'll see in a minute, attention and concentration, because if you look at what these tests require you to do, you really need to pay attention. Digit span forward, what that is that the tester says a number of a series of numbers to you orally, and then you're required to repeat them back in the same order. So you can imagine that becomes more challenging as the sequence becomes longer. Digit span backward is even more challenging. That's the second half of the test. That's where the tester does the same thing. You know, they provide you with a sequence of numbers orally, and you need to repeat the numbers in reverse order. So that gives you a really good sense for how that particular child's brain is able to kind of manipulate that information in working memory, so that they keep the discrete bits of information in their mind while they are manipulating that information in some way in order to solve a problem or a puzzle. Now, letter number sequencing is a new test for the WISC IV. It's really quite complex and requires a lot of skills on the point of the person who's taking the test. So there's sequencing, there's mental manipulation, there's attention, there's, again, they say short-term auditory memory. I really call it working memory, visual spatial imaging, and processing speed. So the child has to read a sequence of letters and numbers and then recall the numbers in ascending order, and the letters are then recalled in alphabetical order. So again, you can see when you think about what working memory really is, then you can see how those are challenging tasks that really kind of fit the bill with regard to measuring this kind of a task. Now finally, the processing speed index, a little bit different, a little bit it's interesting, and we're going to parse some things out at the end of the talk tonight. But generally, we're talking about processing speed, so that means that these tests are going to be timed. And so efficiency on both of these tests is of the essence. And I'm going to show you some test scores in a little while, but they're a little bit atypical. But for this first test called coding, the child essentially is copying symbols that by hand, to a fine motor, that are paired with a simple geometric shape or number. So there's a requirement where they have to kind of move their eyes from one key down to their workspace where they have cubes, where they have to kind of copy these symbols. And so for our kids, many of whom have poor fine motor or poor visual motor coordination, it really does impact their performance on this task, because it slows them down so much. It's really not a measure of their visual perception or their scanning ability or even their attention or motivation. It's really a function of their fine motor. And so that was one reason why the processing speed subtest got pulled out of the nonverbal reasoning because it just didn't make sense. Now, it's kind of odd that the WISC still chooses to focus on these visual motor coordination tasks, but it's grist for the mill. It's information that we can use, and it's information that we can then build our story around for the child. And then finally, there's symbol search, which of course is timed as well. And it's in this particular test, lots of our kids, our dyslexic kids, do a little bit better in symbol search than they do coding because there's less fine motor involvement. This is more of there's a symbol in the first part of a row, and then there's a whole row of symbols, and a child has to very quickly, as quickly as they can, go through that row and mark all the ones that are the same as the one on the left, the same as the symbol in the search group is the way they describe it. So again, you can see where they have to process very, very quickly. Short-term visual memories involved, coordination's involved, visual discrimination and concentration are the really key issues with that particular test. So if you haven't been through the top 10 tests of the WISC IV, congratulations, you now have. I've thrown this in very quickly as well. What do the different types of scores mean? You've seen this before, but I wanted to kind of just, again, if I repeat exposure, you're going to just become increasingly more comfortable with this information. It will become secondhand to you. So you know that the scaled scores generally operate on a mean of 10, and 8 to 12 would be the average range. And if you look at the bell curve, you see that 8 to 12 essentially is that blue area. So like about 68% of people are going to land in that blue area. And that represents one standard deviation below the mean, one standard deviation above the mean. And then it follows from there. So you can see very quickly, if you go back and take a look at your child's test scores, you're going to be able to very quickly understand what range the subtests landed in and also what range the composite scores landed in, if that's something that's still you're working on. And you can see the composite scores, the mean is 100. So in a normal distribution, between 90 and 110 would be considered average, and 68% of the people who took a particular test ended up within those two ranges, two bands. Now, when we think about analyzing a test like the WISC IV, we can think about it a couple of different ways, and I've implied this, but I wanted to make it very explicit. Inter-individual. We're doing this, big reason is so that we can compare your child to the norm group. And the norm group, again, remember, is that group of kids that serve as the group that is comparative. So you're comparing your 10-year, 3-month-old child to the group of kids who took this test who are also 10 years and 3 months old, so that there's a apples-to-apples assessment of your child's performance relative to somebody the same age. Now, we can also, and from a clinical perspective, this is also super important, we can do it intra-individually so that we're comparing your patterns across subtests and composite scores so that it's all about your particular profile. And we can begin to take a look at strengths and weaknesses. That will again inform our thinking with regard to how we're going to approach intervention. And it also gets us to think about, were there other variables involved that might have caused a difference in their performance? Because remember, the WISC is not the end-all and be-all, okay? So any hypothesis about your child's profile for the WISC needs to either be corroborated or it needs to be refuted by data from other information. So it could be checklist information, could be anecdotal information from the teacher, or it could be another test score that's also normed. That reminds me of what I was talking about last week about the little girl who, by all counts, was a sweet kid, but she had been crunched by the school system for 8 years, and she certainly was insecure, and she certainly was anxious, and she certainly had a modicum of anger, but the psychologist, without even paying attention to anybody else who spent day in and day out with this little girl, decided to give her all kinds of psychoanalytic labels that were just extraordinarily inappropriate. So, got to corroborate and refute, or refute by other outside information, but it's a powerful clinical tool, and it's not going to go away. Now, one question I got from a lot of parents was, what's this general ability index? It would be confusing for them because they're looking for a full-scale IQ, and instead somebody is talking about a GAI. So really quickly and very simply, if there's too much variability in usually working memory and processing speed, you partition those scores out and you calculate what they call a general ability index from the 3 subtests in the verbal comprehension index and the 3 subtests from the perceptual reasoning index, and that gives you a pretty solid score of their general intellectual capability. Now, the caveat is that if there's a big discrepancy between the verbal comprehension and perceptual reasoning indices, then you can't do that. What that might suggest is that, say, for instance, a child had pretty significant expressive and receptive language issues, and so their verbal comprehension was pretty suppressed from a scoring standpoint, but the child had really, really strong nonverbal reasoning abilities, then there would be too much a discrepancy between those two to really render the GAI as being a valuable score to look at. It's just like full scale when we used all 4 indices. So we know from the research that verbal comprehension index and the perceptual reasoning index are highly correlated with what we call G, which is, general ability, which is, again, kind of an intellectual capability. And they also are good measures of what they call crystallized and fluid ability. So crystallized ability might be something like your ability to synthesize abstract stimuli. You could build models very, very quickly. Whereas something like fluid ability would be something like along the lines of comprehension, where, as you age, you are going to be able to be obviously more sophisticated with regard to how you read social situations. So it's going to be more of a fluid ability. I think I'm saying that right. Okay, so I wanted to touch on that because I know that was a question for several of you. Now, to prove my point, I went to the Harcourt assessment is actually the publishers of the WISC. And, they say in their documentation that the general ability index may be a more appropriate global measure of ability for some kids, e.g. kids with what they call learning disabilities, what we would call dyslexia and ADHD. Now, they quote what I was basically saying, which is information processing deficits reflected in lower working memory and processing speed unduly lowers the full-scale IQ and may mask true discrepancies. Excuse me. So I'm basically just backing up what I said from the publishers themselves. Now, so let's the nutshell of the WISC IV role in diagnosing dyslexia. If you were following my work before, you know that I believe that there are 4 key components to a full evaluation. One is the data that you collect through observation, interview, and checklists, which is really super key. Second part is the IQ testing. Third part is academic achievement. Fourth part is processing testing. Cognitive processing testing. How is your brain wired in ways that are going to impact your academic performance? Now, 98% of the time across the world, when you're going to assess IQ, you're going to use the Wechsler scales. As I mentioned before, in rare instances, people tend to use the Stanford-Binet, but it's not very often. So WISC IV role in diagnosing dyslexia, I think just as the evaluation in total should be the cornerstone for determining intervention and treatment, I think the WISC should be one of the bedrock starting places in the terms of building your map as well. I mean, in and of itself, is it enough? No. But it serves a very important purpose. Now, I know there's some people out there who are now saying, you know, it's such an onerous task to give all these tests to these kids. We don't really need to do it. You know, the concepts behind the Wechsler scales aren't keeping up with neuroscience. But quite frankly, for now, I mean, that is the gold standard. That's what we're using. And until somebody's really able to come up with something that's going to be mass adopted, then I think that a skilled clinician who gives a lot of Wechsler scales is going to really find it to be very valuable, because there comes a point at which you become so adept at giving the test that you're more focused on the child's behavior and approach. I mean, you score it correctly, and the scores are great, but you learn so much about the child's style of approaching problems, and that can really inform you in terms of how we're going to take care of this little person when we're all done with this process. That's really, really key. So some of you may remember this. Upper left, you will see all 4 of the indices for the 4 different areas. You got verbal comprehension, perceptual reasoning, and so on. And the first thing you can notice is that the child's verbal comprehension score is solid at the top end of the average range, just bumping up against the upper level or the lower level of the high average range. Pretty much the same with perceptual reasoning. You know, your standard error of measurement is oftentimes plus or minus 3, so you could again say that the child has quite strong perceptual reasoning abilities, or solid. Let's just call it solid. And then immediately, as we move into working memory, we see that they're relative to how well the child did in verbal comprehension and perceptual reasoning. The score fell off pretty significantly. So there's I think it's a 22-point difference between verbal comprehension and working memory. And again, it just continues to get worse in terms of test scores with processing speed. Processing speed is a real issue for this guy. So that will, as we've learned in the last few minutes, that's going to render the full-scale IQ score to be useless. So instead of mapping it or putting it in here, probably you should make a note next to that and say, look, this is not representative of this kid. It represents a lot of variability across these 4 different types of intellectual capability. So this person prorated the IQ score by omitting the processing speed index. I would have gone ahead and just omitted both of them, and that would have ended up giving you that general score that's a little bit more consistent, a lot more consistent with the 2 solid indices here at the top. But that I want to see. I mean, you know, this is going to, again, if you are at that level where you're still trying to figure out what all these test scores mean, you're now going to be able to go back to the last eval that your child has had when they had a WISC, and you could very quickly determine how your child's profile looks like and what means what, basically. So as we come down here, when we look at, remember the subtest scores that are combined, these are standard scores, they're combined statistically to create this 110 up here. And you'll see it's very solid, upper end of the average range to above average. Similarities, again, test very high with regard to G, the general factor. So we know this child has some intellectual firepower. And we see over here a little bit more variability. I wouldn't be too concerned about it. I'm not quite sure what happened with matrix reasoning. But things happen, so I don't know. But you can clearly see that they do have some strong skills in perceptual reasoning as well. Excuse me. Now, with working memory, you can see that you can see where they're beginning to fall off on both tests. So they had a real hard time with maintaining that kind of, you know, the ability to keep those units of information in their head, manipulate them, and solve a problem at the level you would expect based on a full-scale, or not a full-scale score, but a general score that would suggest that their intellectual capabilities are around the top end of the average range. Now, even more denigration here under processing speed, and I would like to know more about what happened, because usually, if you'll remember, coding, by virtue of the fact that it has a fine motor component to it, in other words, it's oftentimes, even if you are really adept at your visual processing, but you have very poor fine motor, you are going to see scores like this because they're timed, right? These guys are timed. And you're going to go so slow, you're going to lose a lot of points that way. But because symbol search is easier on the fine motor end of it, I would expect that maybe this be reversed. So this would be a little higher than this one. So I wonder if this is an issue of attention and concentration or some other variable. Maybe they got distracted for a little while. But I just wonder whether what this particular means. But you can see clearly that processing speed will have to be very carefully considered when you develop the treatment plan, as well as working memory. And you want to think about, now, how is this going to manifest in the classroom, and what can we do about it? What can we do about it in terms of supporting the teacher's efforts to integrate different teaching methods or styles in the classroom in a way that's not onerous to them? And also, what can we do for the child directly to help the child become a little bit more adept, if possible, with their coding and with their processing speed? Now, if it's truly a function of fine motor, I'm of the opinion that that's not going to change very much. So then we talk about accommodations, and we talk about what kind of educational technology do we use. You know, for instance, okay, let's not make this kid print anymore. Let's get them on a keyboard as quickly as possible and get their proficiency up, and things like that. So again, go back and look at your scores if you haven't already, and this won't be such a crazy looking page for you. Now, I went back and did the research, trying to take a look at what the models were out there in terms of understanding working memory, and it sounds like Professor Badley, who started his, he developed his original model in '74 and then kind of built on it. In '86, he had another rework, and then in 2000, he added another piece to this. But generally, they're saying that working memory is a rather complex issue with regard to neurological work. So first and foremost, they talk about, in this model, they talk about the central executive. And so that was, prominent. And it was like the decision maker about how attention is allocated when a person is engaged in a task. So the central executive is essentially, they monitor and coordinate the operation, and I don't know where this came from, but they call them slave systems. So there's 3 other slave systems that are monitored and coordinated by the central executive. Now, this is more along the lines of executive functioning, controlling attentional processes, so it's not a memory store. And honestly, from a neuroscience perspective, we've seen some activation in the frontal lobes during some MRI-type testing, but we're not sure how it all works. We just know that there seems to be, when they do testing with people and they're able to map neural activity, we're seeing some activity specifically in the frontal lobes that they believe is related to this central executive, which, by the way, the executive functioning research does discuss the frontal lobes in that whole area. So going back to this again, we have the central executive here, and then we have what is called the phonological loop. And let me see, I didn't put that, there was a good picture of it, but basically the researchers are describing this thing they call the phonological loop that has basically 2 parts to it. One they considered to be what they call the phonological store. So the idea in working memory is that, you have these short traces of, in this case, in the phonological loop, auditory information that, you hold on to it, you hold on to it, you hold on to it, and then it very quickly dissipates and floats away. Now, it won't float away if you work on rehearsing it. It's like a phone number. Somebody gives you a phone number orally. You're going to repeat it, so it goes from working memory to short-term memory to hopefully longer-term memory. So the second component is referred to as the articulatory loop, which is kind of like a rehearsal unit. So this allows us to keep this auditory information in working memory while we're manipulating it to perform some kind of a task. And they've seen activation in the temporal lobe when they do specific testing in this area, when they're trying to figure out where the neural activity is with regard to the phonological loop, specific to active working memory. So they're seeing some activation in the temporal lobe. Now, fascinating to me was this whole concept that there was another neural component to this called the visual spatial sketch pad, scratch pad. And they call this the second slave to the central executive. And it's the orthographic corollary to the phonological loop. So phonology is going to be auditory, and then this visuospatial scratch pad is going to be, the primary role is to process orthographic images. And all that means is it's a visual cache for what letters look like. Orthographic, just think orthographic, graphic letters, okay? So this is the other side of it. It's kind of like you're talking about decoding. No, I wouldn't have said that's not a good one. Anyway, let's think about it in terms of sounds and symbols, okay? Like the basics in phonology, right? We have to be able to figure out how sounds and symbols go together. In this case, they're talking about this second corollary to the phonological piece that also flows up into the central executive. And when they do, they didn't call it MRI, but it's MRI type testing. It's linked to activation at the occipital or parietal lobe, depending on the complexity of the task. So if it's a simpler task, there was neural firing in the occipital lobe, and when the task became more complex, there was more neural firing in the parietal lobe. Now, why and what's that all about, we don't know yet, but they were able to map it. It's been replicated in the research quite a bit. So they're really feeling comfortable with the idea that this is a multi-component process of working memory. Now, to go back, a final piece here that badly added in the year 2000 was this thing called the episodic buffer. And if you look here on this page, you see it links the visual and the verbal, okay? So here's the visual and the verbal to long-term memory. So somehow there is this episodic buffer that shares information with the central executive shares information with that, and somehow serves as the link to long-term memory. I don't know how. It's called the third slave. It kind of serves as the go-between between the phonological loop and the visual spatial scratch pad. And hypothetically, I don't know what the tie is to long-term memory, but they're definitely seeing activation bilaterally in the frontal and temporal lobes, which, knowing what we know about memory, it seems to fit with lots of other research. So here we go. We've got we've got 4 different processes going on for what we used to quaintly call just working memory, and the concept being that we have this units of information that we can kind of keep juggling in the air while we figure out how we're supposed to solve the problem using that information. Now we have a much more complex model, and it really begs the question, what's the lesson for this? And I think my perspective is the lesson is you look at this model, you say, okay, Well, we know that we need to take care of our dyslexic kids in the phonological area. We know that a lot of our kids need help with working memory. But I think the added value in this model for me is that a lot of times practitioners don't focus on executive functioning skills until the kids are older and there's more demand from the environment in terms of their independent behavior and output. And what it says to me here is that we may want to move in earlier and figure out things that we can do to support the child, either from a teaching perspective or tutoring perspective or self-help skills, self-advocacy perspective, to help them become more conscious of their executive functioning skills at a younger age so that they can begin to kind of cover themselves in that area, because we already know to work on the phonological, we already know to work on the working memory. Now let's figure out how we can do a better job with the central executive function and the decision about attention. That's my thinking anyway. I think that's the lesson that we might be getting from this in terms of working memory. Now, what about processing speed? You know, I really stared this down quite a bit for several hours, before I came to these conclusions that the WISC IV, their working memory subtests really seem to fit better with the evidence-based models that we have than the processing speed subtest, because the processing speed is so hard to parse out, and then you have this, in the WISC, you have all this emphasis on processing visual information, but then it's oftentimes contaminated with by any kid who has visual motor coordination issues. So in other words, it's like, we really need to tease out when we do the WISC and we do the processing speed subtest, do we really know what we're measuring? Or is there contamination there to the point where we need to do more? So there are processing speed tests that you can do on the Woodcock-Johnson cognitive tests. There, you can actually kind of move into the rapid automatic naming that, of course, Marianne Wolf's work in those particular subtests, and see if you can find a way to kind of augment and help us better understand the processing speed capabilities of this child separate from any kind of contamination from fine motor. So the WISC is important because it provides you with that information, but you want to make sure that you're getting as much information about what you think you're testing and as much as what might be getting in the way of your being able to test. Does that make sense? You know what I mean? It's like, well, we were testing for processing speed, but because they had such a problem with fine motor that, we now know that we've already known forever that the kids got poor fine motor, so their processing speed testing is contaminated. What does that mean? You still need to figure out processing speed, because that is going to be a big deal in terms of intervention, because child could very easily get lost in the classroom. So what about processing speed? Is it primarily auditory or is it visual? Does it make more sense to speak of it more specifically? Like you could talk about processing speed with regard to phonology, or you could talk about processing speed with regard to receptive language. So it's really it's really key for us to, as clinicians, to describe what we're seeing clearly enough so that you can interpret that in a way that will help the child. Now again, in this case, with processing speed, you have to be careful about other factors, not just fine motor. Motivation, was it there? Anxiety, depression. And then on the other end of the spectrum would be perfectionism. Are they so bound up by being perfect that they go too slow and they hear the instructions and they have the capabilities, but they're so bound, or they trained themselves up to be so over-focused on the perfectionism that it actually impedes their performance relative to their peers. So it behooves us to look closely at this processing speed issue and be as descriptive as possible. And again, this is where really important information comes from the data collection period. And a lot of times this doesn't just pop up in questionnaires or checklists, so it's something that becomes part of the organic growth through conversation. Because I think that gives us a lot of rich data from which we can work. Okay, well, that is that. I'm going to have this video available to you the next day or two. I'm going to have the slides available to you if you want to just email me if you'd like to take a look at the slides. And I mentioned that I got another webinar coming up next week that's separate from this series, and it has to do with how to find balance with letting your child play and restore during the summer while at the same time making sure that they're continuing to read and keep up with their word knowledge. And that's going to be with Kyle Redford, who is the education editor for the Yale Dyslexia site. And she's also a teacher and a mom of a dyslexic kid. And she's a font of information. So that's going to be really cool. And then finally, I've provided some resources for you. These are really rich resources, specifically around processing speed and working memory. A couple of these are explanatory. They go into greater depth. And a couple of these have a huge number of both recommendations for classroom work as well as for the teacher to support the teacher, and then some accommodations that could also occur that could be either in the classroom or at home or working with a tutor. So if you have any of those questions, if you have any questions about any of those resources, or if this conversation has brought up any other issues for you or questions that you might have, please don't hesitate to contact me. You've certainly got my email address, and you can always go to my website, which is drmichaelhart.com, and I'll be very happy to take care of you. So once again, thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to seeing you next week in our third webinar series.